That's how the word comes to us. It's a way of saying that this is a season of counting until we return to the story of Jesus' life in Advent. But I love the way that language changes over time, and it becomes more expansive, more capable of holding things that maybe it originally did not intend to hold. And so I'm grateful for the reminder that ordinary time is still a time of encounter with God. In fact, the reminder that ordinary time is the longest season of the church year reminds me that the majority of our lives are spent in the kind of ordinary, everyday, unextraordinary time that really comprises most of our lives. I didn't spend a lot of time on social media during my time away, and that was not planned, but I'm still grateful for it. But I did come across a video that prompted me to purchase a book, a novel by Wallace Stegner called Crossing to Safety. And it's a book about two married couples who end up befriending each other and taking care of each other through their lives. And one of the characters is someone who has aspirations to become a great literary figure. And what's interesting about this character is that they never become that great literary figure. And we don't get a lot of novels about people not achieving their dreams, right? You don't have novels. I mean, I even remember reading a book by a writer about writing where he talked about how stories where people just kind of live ordinary lives are not compelling, and that's why we don't see movies about those kinds of people or read books about those kinds of people. But what prompted me to buy this book, this novel, was the realization that for the majority of people across human history, we never achieve our grand dreams and designs. We don't. And that's okay. It's not a mark of failure or unfaithfulness. It doesn't mean that things haven't turned out the way that we wanted or that somehow things have not gone the way that God intended. It's an acknowledgement that for most of us, this is what our lives are, and that these are still good and holy lives, despite perhaps the lack of extraordinary happenings. An ordinary time, a lot like my little sabbatical, was really ordinary. It took place in some amazing landscapes. I got to go from inner city Indianapolis to the mountains of Montana to the beach on the Gulf of Mexico. In just a span of 2 weeks, I was in all of those different places, and they were amazing places to see. But I didn't have nothing but mountaintop experiences in those places. A lot of it was just ordinary. And a lot of the things that I came away from that time with were also the kind of simple reminders that God gives to us again and again and again through our lives. I didn't have even if you think about the big moments in Scripture, they end up in ordinary things, right? Moses is like, show me your glory. And God's like, no, I can't do that. You'll die. And Moses is like, please. And God's like, all right, well, I'm going to put you in this little hole in a rock, and then I'm going to cover you with my hand, and then you can see my backside, right? Like, that's ordinary. More ordinary than I think we give it credit for. And yet, I think what sustains us through all of these ordinary times, simple days, unspectacular months and years, what sustains us through all of that is, and this is going to sound so cliche and so corny, but I promise you that I mean it, is really God's extraordinary presence. It really is God's extraordinary presence that sustains us. I want to linger a little bit on some of the context around our gospel passage. Also, a disclaimer, I forgot how to preach while I was gone. So we're going to relearn it all together, okay? Good, all right. Yeah, Karen's like, are you doing okay this morning? I'm like, I don't know if I know how to do this anymore. So what's happened before Jesus walks on the water, like Christine so beautifully preached last week, Jesus fed the 5,000. And right before that, we get this interruption in the narrative of Matthew's gospel that talks about the death of John the Baptist. So John is killed by Herod, who is the claimant to the throne. He is a client king of Caesar who gets to rule over Judea. And he has married his brother's wife, which according to the law of Moses, and the other thing about Herod, this Herod, is that he claims to be the king of the Jews, but he's not really Jewish. He's a descendant of the people of Esau, Israel's brother. And so he's got a lot going against him in his attempts to be the king of the Jews. And he wants to marry his brother's wife. His brother has died. He wants to marry his wife. But it's against the law. It's contrary to Torah. That's considered, unless there are certain parameters in what's called levirate marriage, where you're helping a deceased brother's line continue. If you're not doing that, this is considered an incestuous relationship according to the law of Moses. And so John, the baptizer, who is a prophet, has roused some rabble about Herod's plans to do this. And so Herod has jailed him, right? So now not only is this a descendant of Esau and not Jacob, who's claiming to be the king of the Jews, but has to go through Caesar in order to exercise that kingship. Now he's not even being obedient to Torah. Do you kind of hear the weight that he's burdening underneath in his attempts to be the king of the Jews? It's not going well, is what I'm trying to say. But Herodias, Herod's brother's wife, who he is making his wife, she also does not want to listen to John's preaching and John's warnings about the necessity of following God's law. And so Herod has a party, and Herodias' daughter, who's going to become his daughter, dances in provocative ways that please the king, and under the influence, I'm sure, of much merrymaking, he promises to her whatever she asks, up to I think in some of the Gospels it says like up to a quarter or up to half of the kingdom, but here in Matthew's Gospel it just says whatever she might ask. And so Herodias goes to her daughter and says, "You want the head of John the Baptist on a platter." So they interrupt the party, or in the midst of this party, Herod doesn't want to kill John because he's stuck between the people loving John and him hating John. But in the midst of this party, he sends soldiers away to have John executed, and his head is brought on a platter to Herodias' daughter. This is happening in the midst of a great party. And on the heels of this, after Jesus hears the news about it, he goes away to a desolate place to pray, to mourn, to lament what the King of the Jews has done. You with me? And Jesus is followed by a crowd, and he has compassion on this crowd. They don't have anything to eat. They followed him out into the wilderness. And when the disciples bring this up to Jesus, hey, you need to send them away because, it's getting late and they don't have anything to eat. Jesus says, you give them something to eat. And of course they say, well, we don't have anything. And then someone says, well, we've got these 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And Jesus says, that'll be enough. And he blesses it and he breaks it. And he continues to break and break and break and break until not only are the 5,000 men who are counted fed, but so are all of the women and children who are unfed as well. And what's amazing about Jesus is that it doesn't matter how many he fed. What matters is that he fed them. Jesus isn't in this for statistical greatness. But there's an interesting contrast that's drawn between Herod and Jesus here. When Jesus feeds the crowds, obviously, as we heard from Christine last week, there's this looking back to God caring for his people in the wilderness after the Exodus, where God fed them with manna, right? I think Christine called them carbs from the sky, which is hilarious. She is so funny, and I wish I was half the preacher that she is. But it also looks forward to another time when Jesus will give thanks for bread and he will break it and share it with his disciples. And so this miracle that Jesus does in the wilderness is the continuation of the miracle that God has always been doing, which is taking care of his people when they don't have enough. And indeed feeding God's people with God's own presence, God's own self. Herod has just been partying, and he feeds those who are not without food as a demonstration of his power. But Jesus provides food for those without food solely because they're hungry. This contrast between the ways of the world and the ways of God, I feel like is really helpful as we move into the story of Jesus walking on water. So I wanted to draw your attention to that. And I'm going to repeat that line. Herod feeds those who are not without food as a demonstration of his power. But Jesus provides food for those without food solely because they're hungry. So often we're tempted to see miracles as a demonstration of God's power, and they are. But Jesus does this for these people because they're hungry. He does it in a way where he's not exercising a claim over them. He doesn't want to hold this over their heads. Jesus isn't, you can imagine a king feeding people as a way of continuing their reliance on him. Whereas Jesus is doing this solely to meet the need in the moment. And yet, as this points backwards to God's provision in the wilderness, and it points forwards to the way that God will always feed his church with his own self, we recognize that this simply is what God is always doing. After the crowds are fed, and 12 baskets of leftovers are collected, which I want to draw attention to that number. I can't remember which church father it is. I think it's Chrysostom, who points out that this means that there was even a basket for Judas to bear. God's provision is so big and so wide and so all-encompassing that in the collection of these baskets for the renewal of God's people, there's even a basket for the traitor to bear. Jesus makes the disciples depart from the crowds, right? That's a word that stands out to me in this passage. Immediately, he made the disciples get into the boat. It doesn't say that he makes the crowds go away. In fact, it says he dismisses the crowds. He sends them. I think sometimes because of the way that language works and the way that it evolves, to dismiss someone means to ignore them, or not to pay attention, or to belittle, or to not think on their needs or their presence or their questions or those sorts of things. And so for us, dismissal has taken on this kind of dismissive connotation. But if you go all the way back into the Latin of it, which I love to show off, so just bear with me, it actually is related to the word for send. He's not sending them away because he doesn't want them. He has met their needs and he is sending them as witnesses. This is what happens at the end of our church services. This is why the Latin Mass is called Mass, because at the end, they are dismissed. They are sent into the world to bear witness to the ways that God cares for the world. In a world which is so prone to forgetting the ways that God cares for it. So Jesus makes the disciples get into the boat and leave, but he sends the crowds back to their homes, back to their towns, back to their extended families to bear witness to what God is continuing to do. And Jesus goes up the mountain to pray. And he goes up the mountain to pray as Moses did. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus is continually signaled as the successor of Moses, as the leader of God's people. He is that prophet like Moses who is greater than Moses that Moses promised. And yet he's more than just Moses' successor. He's the son of David. He's the rightful king. And even beyond that, he is the Son of God. He is prophet, priest, and king. The disciples, having been made to get into the boat, struggle in their going. The crowds don't struggle in the same way. Jesus sends them and they go. But the disciples are made to get into the boat and they struggle. It says that the wind was beating against them, and they were beaten by the waves. And in the fourth watch of the night, which is about between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m., Jesus comes to his disciples. He goes to them. And the way that Jesus goes to them is by walking on the sea. I want, again, just to kind of draw your attention to all of the ways that God's story with his people from the Old Testament is being taken up into the story of Jesus, reenacted in the life and ministry of Jesus, the way that God's life is being given to us again and again and again. So Jesus goes out into the wilderness, the people follow him, he feeds them with the bread of life, and then he goes up on the mountain to pray, and then he goes to his disciples by walking on the sea. In Psalm 77, verse 19, it says, "Your way was through the sea, your paths through the great waters, yet your footprints were unseen." Job chapter 9, verse 8, God is described as the one who alone stretched out the heavens and trampled the waves of the sea. In Isaiah 43, verse 16, it says, "Thus says the Lord, the one who makes a way in the sea, a path in the mighty waters." This is not unprecedented in the life of God for God to do this. Like the feeding of the 5,000, it is a miracle. And miracles often seem to us incredulous. Just think back to Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson edited an edition of the New Testament. Do you know what was really cool about Thomas Jefferson's edition of the New Testament? He wanted it to be for moral teaching, so he took out all the miracles. All the parts that were hard to believe. Not much of a Bible anymore. Miracles often seem to us incredulous. But the great farmer poet Wendell Berry talks about the ways that we cannot recognize the miracle of life because we use the wrong language to speak of the world and its creatures. Now, he wrote this in the year 2000, or at least that was the year that my edition was published. Maybe it's older than that. But listen to how salient this is for our day. Our language has reclassified from creature to machine, making us strangers to our own lives. Humans cannot significantly reduce or mitigate the dangers inherent in their use of life by accumulating more information or better theories, or by achieving greater predictability or more caution in their scientific and industrial work. To treat life as less than a miracle is to give up on it. And Jesus tells us who he is. He goes out to his disciples walking on the sea, but when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It's a ghost," because it's the only explanation that they can come up with. And they cried out in fear, but immediately Jesus spoke to them. That word immediately, it's way more common in the Gospel of Mark, but it's no less important for us to see and to hear in this context. The disciples don't know what's going on. They're terrified. They cry out in fear. They misidentify Jesus, but immediately Jesus spoke to them. He does not delay in communicating himself. He says, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." If you were to look at that small statement, "It is I," in the Greek, they're the same words that are used in the Greek translation of the Old Testament when God gives his name to his people. I am. So just as Moses asked the God dwelling in the burning bush to identify himself, because he would need a name when he got to Pharaoh and to the people of Israel enslaved in Egypt, that they might believe him, so Jesus speaks over the waves. I am. This is the God whose name is not a noun, but a verb, and not an action verb, but a being verb. The God who made the seas, walks upon them, not as a stranger to them, but as the one who has made them and loves them despite their churning chaos. You might remember at the beginning of Genesis, it said the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters, that the earth, that the creation was formless and void. We get this sense that there is nothing but chaos. The seas continue to be a place of danger and unknowing, of chaos. In the flood of Noah, in the story of Jonah, in the prophets. And yet when God walks on the water, he lovingly orders it. This is the God that Paul is confident that in the Christ we see God who is over all, blessed forever. Paul is so distraught that his fellow Jews cannot recognize the God of Israel in the person of Jesus, that he himself says that he would prefer to be cut off from life, that they might recognize their God in Jesus. Peter answers Jesus from the boat, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." We hear the story of Jonah. Storm comes up. The seas were angry that day, my friend, if you're a Seinfeld fan. And they draw lots. And it falls to Jonah, and Jonah says, "Look, this is my fault. I'm not supposed to be here. God has actually commanded me to do something, and I am in the middle of disobeying. So if you throw me overboard, all will be well." So Jonah, now doing the right thing, but probably begrudgingly, is thrown over the side of the boat and swallowed by a great fish. And when he's in the belly of that fish, he prays the words of the psalmist. But what's difficult, I think, to ascertain is whether Jonah really means all the things that he's praying or not. I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Did Jonah call out to the Lord? No, not really. He says, I'm a Hebrew, I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. And the guys in the boat who are pagans, they're like, what have you done? Jonah says, pick me up and hurl me into the sea, and then the sea will quiet down for you, for I know it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you. The guys try not to do it because they're equally afraid that this guy's God will punish them even more if they do this to him. But they pray out with more candor than Jonah. O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood. For you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you. So they picked up Jonah and hurled him into the sea. Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish, saying, I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. For you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the flood surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me. I mean, these are literally the Psalms that he's praying. And at the end of his prayer, the fish hurls him up on the dry land. Peter says, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. Peter is not the star of this story. Too many sermons end with an exhortation for us to get out of the boat, to get onto the water, to follow Jesus into difficult places. The waves are exceedingly large. The wind is battering. Peter gets distracted by it. But I think one of the things that we often miss is that Peter recognizes that his call and his work cannot exist apart from the command of God. He doesn't assume that he's doing any of this on his own. If it's you, command me. If it's you, order me. If it's you, make me to do this. The same way that you made us get into the boat and go. Jesus says, come. And so Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" Peter's obedience is conditioned by the recognition of who it is who is speaking to him. The one who walks on the water and speaks over the waves is the great I am, the God of Israel. Peter is only able to ask Jesus for this command because in all of the days that he's followed Jesus, despite being a person of little faith, a person of small understanding, someone who will continue not to get it completely right through the rest of the gospel, he has developed a love and a trust in Jesus. And yet Peter is not the star of this story, the same way that Jonah is not the star of the book that bears his name. It is the God who has made himself known in Jesus Christ who takes center stage. What gives it away are Peter's words, "Lord, save me." So many of the stories that we love to hear, the stories that we love to tell, are about somebody overcoming insurmountable odds. Heroes. I mean, the biggest movie in the world right now is a 3,000-year-old story about a hero. Maybe not a hero as we understand them today, but a hero nonetheless. And yet Peter is not the hero. He pushes our attention off of him and onto Jesus with the words, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately, there's that word again, immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" I don't hear that as condemnation. I hear the gentle voice of Jesus, the one who is immediately calling out to his disciples to identify himself, the one who reaches out immediately to Peter with Peter's cry for salvation. This is not a reprimand. Jesus is not clicking his tongue or shaking his finger at Peter. He's pulling him up out of the waves. I love the way that icons do this. Anytime that God is doing an act of saving in an icon, whether it's in Jesus or by other means, the person being saved never has a hold of the saver. It's always God grabbing the wrist. The focus and attention is always on the one who saves. Look at the way that Peter's body and hands are even oriented in that second icon. All of our attention is drawn to the one who saves. This is the hero of our story. This is the one who, despite 40 years of wilderness wandering, was immediately always there for Israel. This is the one who, throughout our lives, even when we feel far, even when we feel removed, even when we don't feel spiritually sharp, even when we doubt, even when we don't see the way clearly, even when we're not sure where the next meal will come from, even when things seem as though they are beyond a loss, and we're ready to cut and run. This is the one who is immediately there for us, who gathers us up by his own strength, who speaks to us tender words, reassuring us that we can trust in him. And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. And those in the boat worshiped Jesus, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." The last time that Jesus' disciples were on a boat with Jesus in the middle of a storm, Jesus spoke peace over the wind and the waves, and they ceased. And the disciples wondered, "Who is this that even commands the wind and the sea?" This time they don't wonder. This time their eyes are opened up in recognition. This time they worship. And they know that this one like Moses, this king like David, is the Son of God, the one who has come to save them. Let's pray.